I actually think it's a very, very serious law that will boomerang and hurt Israel very badly. And let me explain why. Because only UNRWA distributes and can distribute food in Gaza, for example, which is the place under the worst crisis, humanitarian crisis right now. If Israel stops their activities completely, and their offices are operated out of West Jerusalem in Israel, so that's a possibility depending on how the law is interpreted. Israel will automatically put itself on a blacklist of countries using starvation as a form of control of a population.
Israel has banned the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, from operating in the country, a move which could hamper its work in Gaza. Noga Tarnopolsky is a correspondent in Jerusalem, has been covering Israel and Palestine for decades. Always a useful voice to have on our programme as well. Noga, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Why and how has Israel done this?
Well, how it did it, interestingly, is by a parliamentary vote and not by a government decision. But it's a very, very complicated. You guys were speaking about nuance before, and this is a subject that really requires that. UNRWA is a strange agency. It's a refugee agency directed only at the Palestinians, as opposed to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees that handles every other refugee crisis in the world.
Okay.
And over, the 75-year period, it has developed into being something like a parallel government in many Palestinian communities. So it has become in charge of education, of medicine distribution, of all sorts of things, and actually has never, ever engaged in resettling refugees, which is what every other refugee agency does do.
And so, if it's been involved, it's become effectively a proxy government in the territory. Does that mean it's had to have some relationship with Hamas? And that's one of the concerns I know that some people have with it, that it's seen as being supportive of Hamas in some form or another because it's so much a part of the governing establishment.
Right. So in Gaza, only in Gaza, where Hamas has ruled since 2007, after a violent coup d'etat. And I always mention this because so many people on all sides of this argument like to say, well, the Palestinians voted for them. And they say this either to say the Palestinians deserve them or the Palestinians chose them. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. Hamas took power in a very violent coup d'etat in Gaza. And the UN did what it always does, the UN and this particular agency, which has accommodated itself to the local rulers so that it could operate. The issue is UNRWA has handled the last year, I would say, particularly terribly. And I'll give you one recent example, which is that about 2 weeks ago, Israel engaged in a targeted killing of what it called a Hamas operative in Beirut, in Lebanon, another country where there are many Palestinian refugees. And the organization came out with a very angry statement about Israel murdering its employees and said that this gentleman was a valued teacher. At the same time, Hamas issued a death notice for what it called its commander in Beirut. Same guy. And when the UNRWA director, a Swiss fellow called Philippe Lazzarini, was asked about it the next day, very defensively, he said to the journalist, well, I never saw commander on his CV. So things have been handled poorly. That said, I'm saying all of this, though, to explain how actually terrible this Israeli vote is, because Israel is not proposing any alternative to the work that UNRWA does do. However corrupt and however problematic UNRWA is UNRWA in Gaza and in some places of the West Bank does work that no one else can do.
Well, just clarify what that is, Noga, because that's what I think that's crucial. So by banning them effectively, are they limiting their ability? Because you say they're a refugee agency. Presumably, do they involve it in handing out supplies, handing out aid, and will that stop as a result of this? Do you think?
So the Israeli law is a very slippery law, and what it says specifically is that this law applies only to UNRWA actions, UNRWA activities in the sovereign state of Israel, which does not include either the West Bank or Gaza, which are areas over which Israel has military control, but it's not part of the sovereign state. So this is a law that some people think is intended to be declarative and just, an expression of disgust at UNRWA, but won't do anything. I actually think it's a very, very serious law that will boomerang and hurt Israel very badly. And let me explain why. Because only UNRWA distributes and can distribute food in Gaza, for example, which is the place under the worst crisis, humanitarian crisis right now. If Israel stops their activities completely, and their offices are operated out of West Jerusalem in Israel, so that's a possibility depending on how the law is interpreted. Israel will automatically put itself on a blacklist of countries using starvation as a form of control of a population. So Israel has put itself in a real bind. And as a result of that bind, this is a law that was voted in yesterday, but will only come into effect in 3 months. And during that 3 months, it appears Israel's going to try and finagle some other solution, either for the distribution of urgently needed humanitarian aid, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, or find some way to reinterpret the law for it to be less severe.
That's so interesting, Noga. Really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
That's Noga Tarnopolsky there, correspondent in Jerusalem, regular on this programme, explaining what's going on in that particular very complicated part of the world.
Let's speak to the Israeli government spokesperson, David Mentzer. David, good evening to you.
Hello there.
Who is lined up to take on the work of UNRWA?
Well, let me share with you, first of all, the case against UNRWA, because that's absolutely very important in terms of who replaces UNRWA. Firstly, many of the employees of UNRWA actually took part in the October 7th massacre. That was the killer point, really. But also, so many of the facilities used for weapons storage were actually UNRWA facilities, including schools, which have been found to store weapons and serve as a cover for Hamas tunnels. Don't forget, the Hamas computer server farm actually sat beneath UNRWA's headquarters. So there's complicity there. And also, don't forget the education as well. Almost every school in Gaza was run by UNRWA. And you can be sure that the education which Gazans got in those schools was just plain, simple Jew hatred. It presented an anti-Israel narrative of violence.
Can we say that for sure, though, David?
Yeah, we can say that for sure, unfortunately. We wish it wasn't the case, because a lot of us were living under the illusion that we could live with UNRWA, and hopefully it was doing good work. We knew that around the periphery that there were issues with it, but we thought on the whole it must be doing good work. But, Sinwar himself, when his lair was discovered, it was found with lots of UNRWA merchandise and coats and helmets and bags and paperwork, and even his bodyguards had UNRWA credentials. So look, this organization, which should look after Gazans that deserve a better future, unfortunately just perpetuated the conflict. So you're right, there does need to be a better solution for ordinary Gazans. And there are other organizations. I won't go through each of them today, but it's certainly up to the UN to step up its game to provide a better future for ordinary Gazans, rather than perpetuating the conflict and then telling them in their school system, which is funded by the UN, hardworking British taxpayers' money amongst it, that one day teaching Gazans, you'll be able to get rid of Israel and move back to other areas.
Again, we can't stand that up. I've been looking for reports that can ratify that across all UN schools, UNRWA-operated schools in Gaza, for example, and I can't stand that up. Look, this is a preliminary reading, or has been a preliminary reading. How soon would it be enacted? How soon could UNRWA be unable to operate in Israel, and so therefore unable to operate into Gaza, into the West Bank?
So, Kate, this wasn't a government bill. This was a backbencher bill. But look at the results. It was, I think, 92 in favor of cutting the legs off this organization about 10 against in our 120-person parliament. So that means it was cross-party from left to right. It's a huge majority for this bill. And the bill itself, again, it's not a government bill, but from reading it, it says 90 days. Now, that means that the challenge is on for the UN to provide a better solution for ordinary Gazans. One of the points that often, which doesn't come across, is the sheer inefficiency of UNRWA. Not only were they in collusion with the terrorists, but there's 600 truckloads of aid on the Gazans.
Well, hang on. Didn't the United States write to you, Israel, to ask you to ensure the free flowing of aid? They gave you 30 days, and if not, they said that there would be consequences. They didn't blame UNRWA. They pointed the finger at Israel and said that you were preventing aid entering Gaza. You were helping to contribute to a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We know that the US has backed UNRWA as well. So you're sort of giving me your perspective, which is, I totally respect that. But it goes against what nations like the United States, their defense secretary, their secretaries of state have been writing to you saying.
So that's the spin. Let me give you the facts.
It isn't the spin. A letter went from Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary,
so
and the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to Israel to say, you need to speed up aid. Okay, we only heard about that letter about 3 or 4 days after it was sent. And lo and behold, after it was sent, aid increased, the flow of aid increased into Gaza. So you paid attention to that letter, and the free flow or aid was certainly more free flowing. So it's a load of nonsense. Is it just a coincidence that aid started to flow in after you issued that ultimatum by the United States?
So aid has been flowing in since about a week after the October 7th massacre. There's been more than 1 million tons of aid which has gone into Gaza. Where there have been problems, it's been problems of Hamas stealing the aid, profiting on the black market from that aid, and using that money to perpetuate this war.
Well, then surely you should be protecting UNRWA, organisations like UNRWA, getting that aid in. The reason why the United States issued that warning was that no aid had reached the ground in Gaza for a fortnight.
Again, Kate, that is factually incorrect, because every day I give a press conference from Monday to Thursday, and I list the hundreds of trucks of aid which goes in. So and let me finish this point.
It isn't my falsehood. That's what the United States said. So are they telling lies now? Is the Defense Secretary and the Secretary of State telling lies?
We take the US, whatever the US shares with us as our closest ally in the world. We take it very, very seriously, and we are stepping up our aid. But there is literally no limit to the amount of aid that we can facilitate to put into Gaza. But unfortunately, once it gets into Gaza, it is mismanaged by people like UNRWA. It is funneled off to Hamas to fund a black market, which perpetuates the war against us. And of course, it doesn't get to ordinary Gazans. Now, we have tried to bypass that by literally flooding the area with aid. And if your listeners are interested, there's a POGAT, which is the organization on the Israeli army, which facilitates the entry of this aid, can show you every single day the amount of aid which has gone in. But of course, the issue is Hamas stealing that aid. But we're taking apart Hamas.
Okay.
We've already killed their leader. We're already taken apart their leaders.
All right.
And we're making sure that the aid gets to ordinary Gazans that deserve it. But UNRWA are part of the problem, not part of the solution.
You cite several, hundreds of UNRWA staff who are complicit with Hamas. The Israeli government issued a statement saying that 12 of the agency's employees participated in the Hamas-led October the 7th attack last year. That is, of course, absolutely awful, but they are known as the Dirty Dozen. 12 of them all are now, dead or are not working with the agencies anymore at all. And what we've seen today is foreign ministers from 7 different countries expressing concern about you not allowing UNRWA to operate in Israel and so therefore preventing aid from going into Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. These foreign ministers say the move would mean fuel distribution in Gaza and the West Bank would be severely hampered, if not impossible. What do you say to that? 7 different countries, including the UK, asking you to think again.
So what we would say very clearly, and you should listen to my words very clearly, that any state that funds UNRWA is helping a terrorist supporting organization that is harming the region and its future.
Sorry, UNRWA are a terrorist supporting organization.
UNRWA are a front for Hamas. They've proven that case. Only these 12 people which you mentioned, we got that kicking and screaming out of UNRWA. We've also provided literally hundreds of names of UNRWA employees who are also members of Hamas. We know that the UNRWA school system says from the river to the sea. Soon you'll be able to kick out the Jews from Israel, and you'll be able to take back your land in Haifa and Jaffa and other places in this country. So in a sense, UNRWA are the cause of the problem here. We need aid inside Gaza, which doesn't seek to kick Israel off the face of the earth, but seeks to live with us, to work with us, and of course, to provide that all-important aid to ordinary Gazans. Ultimately, though, it must be up to ordinary Gazans to improve their lives for a better future for their own children, rather than simply thinking of their only destiny as either the jihadi way, which is either death or victory. We want them to live together with us in peace. We're providing a better future because we're liberating Gaza from Hamas to provide a better future for all of the people in this region.
David Mencer, thank you for joining us. Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer there.